was shot in an armed robbery. I had a shootout in an armed robbery. I was stabbed and in the arm in prison, and I was shot by a guard in prison. 19, my father came here from Texas in 1909, I think. And most of the blacks in Los Angeles was concentrated on the east side along Central Avenue, and it was basically north of Slauson to downtown. But you had a large population of blacks that was downtown LA. And you would have to be 100 to really know about this, and possibly it's not documented. But you had the first evolution of what you would call gangs at that particular time. And you had a shoe shine crew, and you had the Dice Boys, and they had territory, you know what I'm saying? And there was hustlers. And the only time they came into conflict is when one was in another's territory. The shoe shine crew would have shoe shine boxes, and they would be all downtown, shining shoes, and the Dice Boys had dice games. And they concentrated on the soldiers. When they would come to town, they would have dice games in different places, in the Navy, in the Army. And the soldiers at that particular time would be shooting craps. So this began a development of what you call crews, and from that sprung up along Central, you had neighborhoods, At that particular time, usually it was one-on-one, and it was all about, head up, knife play every now and then, but mostly it was head up. This is what my father told me. If my father was living now, my father would be approximately, 100 and, he was born in 1901, so he'd be about 118 if he was living. And he used to tell me these stories when I was very small. That's why I call myself a man-child. And he used to tell me stories about how he was a dice boy, and how they used to learn how to block, you know what I'm saying, and do different games with dice. Different people would be involved, in the game, you understand me, and they'd find a sucker, you understand me, and they'd be switching dice and things of that nature. So that was a understanding that I got at a young age about groups. When I became older, I was in the Roman 20s, and that's when I started hearing about the Roman 20s and the Yellow Jackets and the Purple Hearts and cliques of that nature. But that was evolution coming up into the early 50s, But gang activity per se, or groups, or teenage organizations have been around in LA among the blacks going way back until the teens, 1913, 1920, years and years ago. So the gang aspect is something very old. But the violent aspect of it, you understand me, has just came into effect, say 30 or 40 years ago. Because in gang activity, my dad told me back then, usually a dude was either hit in the head and died, or either he was stabbed and died. But gunplay among youngsters at the age of 13, 14, and 15 was non-existent. It just wasn't happening then. But the clicking and the coming together of groups is nothing new. It's been going on ever since we've been over here. You know what I'm saying? So, it's nothing new about gang activity in Los Angeles. Crips and the Bloods, they got so much reputation, but the reputation came about through the killings. If there were no killings, the reputation wouldn't got as large as it has gotten, or had gotten back into, back in the 70s when it started escalating at a tremendous rate,
When was the first time you went to state prison?
First time I went to state prison was in 1973, and they sent me straight to San Quentin.
What was the racial politics like back then?
Well, at the time that I went to San Quentin, at that particular time, you had BGF, you had a lot of Hispanics from the South. Usually they were spearheaded by the Mexican Mafia. You had brothers from Northern California. The politics at that particular time in 1970, last 73 and 74 was pretty on edge around San Quentin. That particular time, Munson's was there. When I got to San Quentin, they were already there.
What was the tension like with the Mexican mafia?
Well, in 1974, in the month of December, there were a lot of tension between blacks and the Southern Mexicans, which primarily was Emmy. A brother had gotten out of the hole, and he had spit on a dude in the cell, and consequently, when he got out, he got hit. They sent word from the hole, and he got stabbed, and consequently from that, tension grew, and then a week or so later, after a couple of lockdowns here and there, 3 blacks was killed in one day in San Quentin. That was about, I think it was sometime in December of 1974. Quentin basically stayed on lockdown almost 6-7 months. I was shipped out. They never let me back on the line because of my affiliation, and they sent me to Folsom. I was one of the youngest ones that went to Folsom and went on the line at that particular time in the first part of 1975, because usually you had to be over 30 to go on the line. But I had did so much time in so many federal pens, and I had a jacket of being affiliated, that they decided to go on and send me to Folsom.
Where did the white group stand in all that?
Well, Aryans and the bikers, they basically always backed, always with the mafia. During my stay in San Quentin, there were no incidents that I could remember of at that particular time when I was in Quentin between blacks and what it was called Nazis, the Aryan Brotherhood at that time. Even when I went to Folsom. But when I went to Folsom in 1975, Folsom was somewhat of an older convict type of institution that I was used to, because I was in Leavenworth and Marion Federal Penitentiary. And you had older convicts that did time for a long period of time. And you had convicts with legendary names. You know, I did time there with Sitting Bull out of Watts, and Howard Lundy, and quite a few dudes that was originally there in the institutions before George Jackson had ever come to the pen. These dudes had started coming to prison in the late 50s and stuff, and they were much older, and the atmosphere at San Quentin at that particular time was much different than it was when I came back years later. I came back to Folsom and was put in the hole and in one building, and the institution at that particular time in 1983 was primarily, pretty much Crips. You know, they were all over the pen. 83, 84, around in there, it really started changing. You know, and the whole population in the Department of Corrections in California became primarily a younger population, and you basically had a lot of Bloods and Crips that had took over the population of the California pens.
All right, going back to your first stay in the penitentiary, I wanted to know what the residue of George Jackson's death was like.
Well, when I came to Quentin, I had already did 5 years in the federal pen. I first went to the penitentiary in last part of '66. I didn't get out into '71. But when I went to Quentin, that was in 1970, last of '73, first of '74 is when I went to Quentin. And George had already been assassinated. Yogi was in the hole then, Hugo Pinell, and San Quentin basically was like a murder for hire type of atmosphere. There was a lot of stabbings, a lot of lockdowns. You know, I had never been locked down so much. You know, I was there approximately a year, and I don't think I hit the line and was out in population no more than 3 months because it was constant lockdowns. It was a lot of activity going on in San Quentin at that particular time in 1974, first part of 75.
Did the revolution pick up steam after his death?
Well, in the institutions, I believe it was an escalation, especially in California, of organizing, and you know, you had different groups of individuals. You know, you had a different type of activity, which I can't expound on to a major degree. I know for a fact in 1982 in CRC, Duck from 8-9 neighborhood, East Coast, rest in peace. Duck was the shot caller at that particular time in CRC, and we got real close, and he began to organize, you know, the Crips there. Then later on, when I came back to prison, he was in Tracy, and he was calling shots in the car at Tracy. So Duck, during his period of incarceration, was always at the head of the Crip movement.
What was it like for the Bloods that was coming in there in the 70s?
Well, when I was in San Quentin in 73, 74, there were basically no Crips there. Munson, they were young. You know, at that time, most of them was beginning to go to YTS or to Tracy or Solidaire North, you know. But you had a lot of people from the North, a lot of people from the South that was basically in organizations at that particular time. And it was kind of really a mess, you know. I was used to a lot of organizing in the federal pen, and we didn't have a major conflict, Hispanic and blacks, in the federal pens. The riots that I was involved in Lompoc in 1968 was white and black, and I was shipped out of there and sent to Leavenworth, and then eventually I went to Marion Federal Penitentiary. Marion was in the swamps in southern Illinois, and Marion took the place of Alcatraz. They closed Alcatraz, and they built Marion, and that's where they sent all of what you call the undesirables, and they called me an undesirable. Yeah, at a very young age, you know, I was one of the youngest ones in Marion, you know, because the average age at that particular time in Marion was in the 40s. They were in their 40s and 30s. You know, if you were in your 20s or early 20s, you had a real reason to be at Marion. And they had to get authorization to send me there because I was so young. What I dislike and don't want to see is somebody that's 20, 25 years old that's talking to somebody that's 15 or 12 years old and glorifying what they're doing. You understand me? That the influence, you know, is a negative influence when it should be a constructive and positive influence. Gangs per se are never going to stop, but the killing can stop. You know, the activity can be beneficial for you. You know, you learn how to socialize and so on and so forth. You know, you learn the ups and the downs of life. But the killing aspect, you know, the useless killing aspect of it, you know, I wish it could be stamped out.
How important do you think it is for the original Crips and Bloods to dialogue?
Very important, because you could say now, you got gang members now that's 30 years old, that's 35 years old, and you have teenagers that's 15, 16 years old that have heard about them. If, such as you have on your, I've seen on your videos, you have some that are 60, 61 years old. Now, a 60 or 61 years old, or myself, 71 years old, talking to a 13-year-old and glamorizing now, I'm not saying that I have any intention of glamorizing gang activity, but putting it in its right perspective, well, then you got these youngsters that'll have a different view of it. But when you got a man that's 30, 50 years old talking about who he killed or who he shot or how tough he was and so on and so forth, and you got a 13-year-old mind listening to this, that's bad.